Okay, let's talk about paradoxes and problems for omnipotence. In order to set the stage for talking about paradoxes and problems for omnipotence, we need to make an initial decision. The decision is about what the targets of God's potential power, activities, and that sort of thing are aimed at. Our initial simple approach would have us talk about tasks or actions that can be performed. You can build a house, you can paint a barn, that sort of thing. Notice, though, that there are two aspects when we talk about actions or tasks. Tasks can be done by any number of different people. But then there's also the person performing the task. This distinction between a complete state of affairs or situation and a partial description of a state of affairs or description is crucial because some of the issues surrounding the doctrine of omnipotence involve human limitations. So, for example, I can add a column of figures incorrectly. So can you. That's a task. Can God add a column of figures incorrectly? Presumably not. Does that show that he's not omnipotent? If you take the target of God's activity to be tasks, it looks like you're stuck with this problem. It looks like limitation features of human beings would undermine the doctrine of omnipotence. There is, however, a simple solution here. Instead of talking about tasks as the target of an account of omnipotence, perhaps we should talk about propositions or states of affairs or something more complete. So think of a task like a sentence fragment. It's the predicate of a sentence. Building a house. Builds a house. That's a task. It's also not a complete thought. You have to fill in the subject term to get a complete thought. So maybe it should be something more like complete thoughts that are the targets of God's potential activity. So think about adding a column of figures incorrectly. I've done it, so I can do it. God can't do it. But notice there are two different complete states of affairs here. There's the state of affairs of my adding the column incorrectly, and there's the state of affairs of God's adding the column incorrectly. Presumably, God can't bring about that God adds this state of affairs incorrectly because God can't make mistakes. There's also the state of affairs of my adding the column incorrectly. Can God bring about that state of affairs? Yeah, that's not hard at all. All sorts of things can make me make mistakes when I'm adding a column of figures. So some limitation properties are handled easily just by distinguishing task-based accounts of omnipotence from state of affairs-based accounts of omnipotence. Not all limitation properties get solved that easily. Notice that I picked a rather neutral piece of behavior for the topic of discussion for the first limitation property. But suppose we pick something that's more morally charged. Suppose we pick the property of doing something that's wrong, say murder or theft, intentional theft, that sort of thing, where you do something that theologically would get counted as a sin. So we have a capacity to sin. God doesn't have a capacity to sin. Let's suppose for current discussion. We talked a bit about that when we talked about omnibenevolence. The standard view is that God can't sin, not just that he won't, but that he can't. So let's assume that for the moment. Is that enough to undermine the doctrine of omnipotence? The first thing to think is, well, maybe that's like the other limitation properties. But it turns out it's not. It's different than adding a column of figures incorrectly, because in order to sin, you have to do something intentional, you have to do something for which you're morally responsible. And unusual account so in order for you to sin, you have to do something freely. Let's suppose that all of that is true. There are lots of links there that can be questioned, but let's just not do so. Now, with respect to my adding a column of figures incorrectly, there's no implication of human freedom or anything or moral responsibility going on there. But when it comes to sinning, you can't do it accidentally and have it count as a sin because it's supposed to be something that you're morally responsible for. Now, if we assume God can't sin, but we can, then I can bring it about that I sin, but God can't bring it about that God sins. That doesn't solve the problem, though, because God can bring it about that I add a column of figures incorrectly. Can he also bring it about that I sin? An initial response here would be, well, if God brings it about that you do something, then God's responsible for it, not you. How is a defender of the doctrine of omnipotence supposed to handle this problem? The solution, adopted by defenders of the doctrine of omnipotence, distinguishes between strongly and weakly bringing something about. So God strongly brings something about when God does something that entails that thing happens. So he strongly brings it about that I make a mistake in adding a column of figures. What that means is God does something, and given that God does that thing, I add the column of figures incorrectly. It follows logically from that. That's strong bringing about. Notice that's the sense of bringing about that causes problems when it comes to the topic of sin. Because if God does something that entails that I sin, then I'm not the one responsible for what just happened, and hence I didn't sin. So, what can a defender of omnipotence say about limitation properties of human beings that implicate moral responsibility? How can God bring that stuff about and yet not be the one who takes over all of the responsibility? The answer is there's supposed to be a weak sense of bringing about that accomplishes this. In the weak sense, God does something, and here's a truth. If God were to do that thing, then I would freely choose to do something that's bad. In that sense, God can weakly bring it about that I do something for which I am morally responsible because I was free to do otherwise and I chose not to. And nonetheless, God brought it about. You will notice that this is the same appeal to counterfactuals of creaturely freedom that was distinctive of Molinism. They'll do the trick so long as there are truths of this sort and enough truths of this sort. So first, some people doubt that there are truths of this sort at all. We talked about that when we talked about Molinism. Second, some people wonder how many of these truths there are. Are there enough of them so that God can bring about any particular limitation property involving moral responsibility that there might be? Let's reflect a bit more on whether there are gaps here. There is a simple argument that there can't be any gaps here. The simple argument appeals to the law of conditional excluded middle. Excluded middle is the claim that it's provable that either P or not P, no matter what value for P you pick. Put a disjunction between them, use the word or, let the first one be unnegated and the second one negated, and then one of the two is going to come out true. Call that excluded middle. Conditional excluded middle is when you bury the P or not P part, when you bury each of those disjuncts behind the same antecedent. So let R be the antecedent. R implies P, or R implies not P. That's the law of conditional excluded middle. That law works for some kinds of conditionals. It's a true law for certain kinds of conditionals, but our question is whether it's true for the counterfactual conditionals that are distinctive of Molinism and are being appealed to here to help us characterize some notion of weakly bringing about in order to salvage the doctrine of omnipotence. The problem is there are counterexamples to the law. This counterexample, it's an updated version of a counterexample that David Lewis used. Lewis's counterexample had to do with Reagan and Gorbachev, but I'm going to switch to Trump and Putin. So here's the claim. If Trump and Putin were compatriots, Trump would be Russian. I think you're probably inclined not to agree with that claim. If the law of conditional excluded middle is correct, then you either have to accept that claim or the following one. If Trump and Putin were compatriots, Trump would not be Russian. That doesn't sound any better than the first one, though. The reason both of them sound weird is because there are two ways for the two people in question to be compatriots. They just have to have the same nationality. So either they're both Russian or they're both American. Those are the two most natural possibilities. I suppose there are other possibilities for people to be compatriots. I hear there's England and Sweden and Norway and lots of other countries. So if they were just members of the same, citizens of the same nation state, they'd be compatriots. The natural ones, though, the ones closest to the way the world is, are the nationalities of each of the respective people. So you're stuck with the claim that either, if they were compatriots, they'd both be Russian, or if they were compatriots, they wouldn't both be Russian. Neither would be Russian. Since neither one of those claims sounds true, we can't use the law of conditional excluded middle to defend the idea that there are enough counterfactuals of creaturely freedom to do the job that needs to be done. Because remember, what's needed is a counterfactual of creaturely freedom for every limitation property that implicates moral responsibility for human beings. Go back to the Trump and Putin example. Let's call that an indeterministic connection. Both of the claims are false about which nationality would be shared because the connection between the antecedent and consequent is completely indeterministic. Let's use that language to talk about cases where the law of conditional excluded middle fails. Are there indeterministic connections between any set of circumstances God could put you in and some particular way of sinning? That's an open question as far as I can tell. Even if you grant that there are counterfactuals of the sort the Molinist needs, it isn't clear that there are enough of them. It's essential to the view that there are enough of them. But just because it's essential to the view doesn't mean you get to endorse it without argument. You have to explain why it's true. So, two kinds of properties. First, limitation properties in general. Those can be handled by distinguishing between task-based and state of affairs-based accounts of omnipotence. Then there are limitations that implicate moral responsibility. Those can't be handled in the same way.